Hi everyone, we're in week 5 and this is the first lecture and we're going to be introducing concepts of tropical disease, one of my favorite topics. I spent several years working in Kenya, did a little bit in Tanzania and Malawi, and so developing country health and tropical health is really one of my favorite subjects, and I'm happy to present it to you today. So the first question is, what is tropical infectious disease? The name is somewhat contentious, but the official definitions are tropical disease encompasses all disease that occurs solely or principally in the tropics. In practice, this term is often taken to refer to infectious diseases that thrive in hot, humid conditions such as malaria, leishmaniasis, schistosomiasis, onchocerciasis, lymphatic filariasis, Chagas disease, African trypanosomiasis, and dengue. That's from the WHO. Manson, which is the definition recorded on the Wikipedia site, defines it as tropical diseases are diseases that are prevalent or unique to tropical or subtropical regions. But there's problems with this definition that I think we need to get out of the way first. The first is that not all tropical diseases are actually tropical. Like HIV, for example, is an example that's considered to be a tropical disease, but we know, all of you know, that it occurs here in the United States, in Europe, and other developed countries. Malaria also used to be endemic in the United States and in Europe all the way up to Finland. Really until very recently, the 1960s, I believe, is one of the last cases here in the US. So when we say that something is a tropical disease, really we have to take that definition with a grain of salt. Part of the reason we call it this is because of this. The world in 1914 that you see here on this map shows that most of the world was dominated by European powers. Tropical disease came out of that time, that era, when Europeans were expanding into various locations all throughout the world. And this actually included Japan as well, who expanded into East Asia. And tropical disease was considered to be the disease or health conditions that the colonialists experienced when they got to these regions. Tropical medicine, quote, served two functions. First was to protect the health of colonialists, to enable colonial expansion, and this included the military during wartime. When Brits or whoever went to India to administer the colonial government there, there needed to be ways to protect them from diseases and health conditions that they had no experience with in Britain, for example. And so plenty of research went into creating new medicines and new treatments and new preventative methods to protect the colonial administration from the diseases that they might experience there. And also, it was intended to establish a minimum level of health for indigenous peoples to ensure a stable labor supply to support colonial efforts. So when we talk about tropical disease and tropical medicine, we're looking at disease through the lens of a bygone past colonial era. And the effects of that era continue until this day, and we're going to get to a little bit of that in a second. Most tropical diseases, all of them, existed prior to colonialism. Other diseases were made worse. Fix my tie here. There we go, fine. Nomadic populations were made sedentary by restrictions on borders. So for example, in Kenya, there were new restrictions on where pastoralists could take their cattle around, for example, that didn't exist before or were indigenously maintained. Population growth was a massive change that happened to sub-Saharan Africa in particular, where large numbers of people were born and moved into urban environments and created new opportunities for disease transmission of all kinds. There was disruption to traditional means of sustenance and health care, and disruption of traditional societies and hierarchies of leadership, which made communities less resilient to changes in the public health. This isn't to say that life was better then than it is now. We don't really know that and can't really say that. It's impossible to sort of explore the counterfactual and see what would have happened if there had been no colonialism. Life expectancy is considerably longer in 2020 than it was back in 1720, and this is true of developing countries as well as developed countries. But the reality was the sudden disruption to societies was devastating to indigenous populations and changed the landscape of public health in ways that we still feel today. So, first, what are some examples of tropical diseases? We can think of many, of course, some that you know and some you may not know. The most famous probably is malaria, which you see in movies and hear about in the news, maybe, sometimes. Yeah, sometimes, I don't know. Cholera is one that isn't even really tropical. I mean, we know that John Snow famously turned off the Broad Street pump in London in the 19th century. So we know it existed there, obviously. Tuberculosis, if you are a fan of 19th century literature, tuberculosis is actually a sort of supporting character in many stories. So again, not tropical, very much worldwide. And still to this day, I mean, Russia has a very severe problem with tuberculosis. Tuberculosis you see in Japan, certain parts of Japan for sure. Dengue fever, as we know, or maybe you don't know, or maybe you will know when we talk about dengue fever, is encroaching on places like the Florida Keys and due to climate change and all sorts of other factors, and it's often making the news these days. Lassa fever, HIV, as you know about HIV, Chagas disease, which is primarily down in Mexico and Central America, Hansen's disease, leprosy, everyone knows leprosy, guinea worm, which we're going to talk about in a future lecture, leishmaniasis, onchocerciasis. These are all examples of tropical diseases. These are not, this is not an exhaustive list. There's many, many more than this. When we look at the world and we look at life expectancy, even here in 2019, we can see some pretty predictable patterns. Sub-Saharan Africa and Afghanistan have the lowest life expectancies in the world. And if you can lay over a map of the colonial powers and their territories, and it will almost match this in a lot of ways. So the point is not to give you a massive history lesson, but I think that public health needs to be contextualized into its history, because we're seeing the public health problems we see today are a result of things that happened in the past. And part of our work as public health researchers and public health advocates is to recognize that past and figure out ways to right this wrong. So, again, if we look on this plot, we can see that x-axis is male life expectancy at birth in years, y is female, and this is generally a linear relationship. Women tend to live a little bit longer than men, but we can see some pretty compelling patterns here, namely that Lesotho, Mozambique, Zambia, Somalia, Uganda, DR Congo, Nigeria and Ethiopia are all on the African continent, and Japan, Macau, Monaco, Singapore, all in Asia, USA and Europe. Well, we know where those places are. So we're seeing is massive disparities in life expectancies between countries and between regions, and regions that all have their own particular history. Infant mortality, same story. Developing countries, especially on the sub-Saharan African continent, have the highest levels of infant mortality in the world. Afghanistan and Pakistan are also very high. When we go to figures like this, where we have x-axis on the log scale, GDP per capita, so per person, and on the y-axis we have child mortality rate, we can see that the more money a country has, the more likely their children are to live past childhood. And the less money a country has per capita, the more likely their children are to die. Now, as public health professionals, I think we need to look at this and to be honest, need to be repulsed by it. I think that figures like this, just personally speaking, are quite compelling, and I think that I'm personally horrified by it. I don't think there should be a price on human life. I don't think there should be this disparity between rich countries and poor countries. I think that every child, whether they're born in Kenya or the United States or Japan or wherever, should have the same opportunity to live a full and healthy life. So put that in the back of your head, and I hope that you all agree with that. So part of the reason that I'm interested in tropical disease and global health is basically this figure, is figuring out ways to right this wrong and make sure that everyone, regardless of where they're born and who they are, has an opportunity to live a full and healthy life. So, in addition to the tropical diseases, there are what we call the neglected tropical diseases. And these are a group of parasitic and bacterial diseases that cause substantial illness for more than 1 billion people globally. That's 1 out of every approximately 7 people. These affect the world's poorest of the poor. NTDs impair physical and cognitive development, contribute to mother and child illness and death, and make it difficult to farm or earn a living and limit productivity in the workplace. NTDs cause what was called a poverty trap. They entrap poor communities into a cycle of illness and poverty that's almost impossible to get out of. The reason these are called neglected tropical diseases is they are, generally speaking, not on the radar of pharmaceutical companies developing new technologies to prevent or treat them, and are often highly underfunded in international programs. So they're neglected. January 30th is the World NTD Day, and there's plenty of social media activities to develop awareness about NTDs around the world. The list of neglected tropical diseases set by the WHO includes these diseases. This is the list. There are not more than this list. Brulee ulcer, Chagas disease, cysticercosis, dengue fever, fascioliasis, echinococcus, I have trouble pronouncing some of these, trypanosomiasis, leishmaniasis, leprosy, lymphatic filariasis, mycetoma, onchocerciasis, rabies, cysto, worms, trachoma, and yaws. This is the list of neglected tropical diseases, and the WHO intends this to be a list that generates awareness of these diseases because they are neglected. We need to look at them more deeply, and they do affect large numbers of people. Now, neglected tropical diseases occupy the various classes of pathogens that we can think of: helminths, viruses, protozoa, and bacteria. Viruses, of course, rabies and dengue, helminths, worms of all kinds, bacteria, Brulee ulcer, leprosy, trachoma, yaws, and protozoans, Chagas, leishmaniasis, and trypanosomiasis. And we'll be talking about some of these diseases in a future lecture. Now, here's what I like to call the neglected tropical diseases, the ones that deserve to be on the list because they are as neglected and cause human suffering everywhere. And they include snake bites, which you can argue is not an infectious disease, but snakes are a vector, and they deliver a substance that causes disease and cause grave injury in many people around the world. I personally studied snake bites for a bit in Kenya and found it fascinating, and was overwhelmed with what a major a complex public health problem it is. And we can get into that a little bit later. Tungiasis, or what's called jiggers, is actually a flea that lives in the soil and attaches to a human or mammalian host, usually to the feet or any sort of skin surface, burrows into the skin head first, uses the blood to reproduce, and then she deposits eggs out her posterior. And during that time, she expands in the flesh and causes pain and secondary bacterial infections, which lead to debilitating illness, lack of mobility, and gangrene and amputation in some circumstances. Major disease. Many people have not heard of it. I had never heard of it before I went to Kenya and studied it. But massive public health problem. Okay, so that is what my short introduction to what tropical disease is and what neglected tropical diseases are. Our next lecture, we're going to be talking about eradication and elimination of diseases, and then we're going to go on to the specific classes of tropical diseases and talking about many of them individually. So thank you very much for watching this. And again, if you have questions, please reach out because I am here to help you.